Over the next few videos, we're going to look at expressions with tener. In English, we'll often say I am for a lot of different expressions, whereas in Spanish, they will switch and say I have. So for example, I'm hungry, I'm cold, I'm tired, I'm scared, I'm successful, I'm lucky. In Spanish, instead of saying I am hungry, they'll say I have hunger. Or instead of I'm cold, they'll say I have cold. So this is what I mean by a lot of common phrases using the verb tener in Spanish. So we're going to go through the most common ones you'll come across. Let's start off with this, to be afraid. Now, of course, in English, we would say I am afraid or I'm not afraid. However, in Spanish, they would express this same idea with I have fear. Now, the word for fear is miedo. So they would literally say, I have fear. Tengo miedo. Of course, this will remain throughout all the different angles. So if we were to ask, are you afraid? It would be, do you have fear? How would you say that? ¿Tienes miedo? What about he, she, or it is afraid? Tiene miedo. We're afraid. Tenemos miedo. They're afraid. Tienen miedo. Now, if you want to add, say, people into this equation, for example, me, you, him, her, us, them, then it's actually quite simple to do that. The phrase becomes tengo miedo de. So literally, I have fear of, and then you would say whoever it is. So I'm afraid of him would become tengo miedo de él. So let's try it for yourself now. How would you say I'm afraid of her? Tengo miedo de ella. I'm afraid of them. Tengo miedo de ellos. If they were a group of all females, this would simply change to ellas. What about asking, are you afraid of him? ¿Tienes miedo de él? How would you say he's afraid of her? Tiene miedo de ella. Of course, if you wanted to make that crystal clear, you could say él tiene miedo de ella. What about we're afraid of you? Tenemos miedo de ti. They're afraid of me. Tienen miedo de mí. One more. They're not afraid of you. No tienen miedo de ti. Going into the past now, we of course have the choice between the imperfect sound of tenía or the simple past, which would be tuve. And both are of course possible depending upon the situation or what you are visualizing. For the moment, let's just stick with this open imperfect sound. So, to express something like I was afraid, you would have tenía miedo. How would you say you were afraid? Tenías miedo. He wasn't afraid. No tenía miedo. We were afraid. Teníamos miedo. They weren't afraid. No tenían miedo. Now let's add people into the mix. Again, you'll use the same formula. For example, I was afraid of her. This would be tenía miedo de ella. Notice I'm still using that open imperfect sound and the same formula just by adding on de plus whatever person it is. So I was afraid of her. Tenía miedo de ella. How would you say they were afraid of him? Tenían miedo de él. Now, things can get a little trickier when it comes to expressing afraid of something. Because as you will see, some expressions will take a and others will take de. For example, this one we have, tienes miedo a las alturas. So you're afraid of heights. But to say you're afraid of dogs, tienes miedo de los perros. So in one, we're using a, and the other we're using de. This is the problem or the issue that we have. So what I'm going to do is give you a fix around this. And we're going to get out of it by using le. So here's the formula that we need to memorize. You're going to put le at the beginning, and then you're going to conjugate the verb tener according to whatever way you need the verb to work for you. Then you will have miedo a. So as you can see, the verb tener is in red because this is the only part of the equation that will change. All the rest will remain stationary. Okay, so you only have to worry about conjugating tener, and the rest stays the same. So let's try to do a little live demonstration of this. Let's imagine that we want to express I'm afraid of heights. So we have our formula here. What we would do is simply conjugate the verb tener. So le tengo miedo, and then they would say of like the heights. So las alturas. Le tengo miedo a las alturas. Now, if we wanted to say he's afraid of heights or she's afraid of heights, again, we would just conjugate the verb tener. So it would become le tiene miedo a las alturas. What about we're afraid of heights? Again, you just conjugate tener. So le tenemos miedo a las alturas. They're afraid of heights. So le tienen, fix our spelling here. Le tienen miedo a las alturas. If you try to think out this formula in a literal way, you're going to find it very confusing, because if we go through it step by step, what we are literally saying in English would be, to it, they have fear of the heights. You can see it really doesn't make much sense. So the easier way is to simply take this as a set formula. Going back again here to the full verb. So you're just focused on conjugating tener. You're going to have the a here followed by whatever it is that you're afraid of. So this is kept as a set formula, and all you have to do is conjugate tener no matter what angle it is. Let's do the same thing now with dogs. So I'm afraid of dogs. So again, we will have I'm afraid of the dogs in Spanish, or so los perros. So le tengo miedo a los perros. Or she's afraid of dogs. So le tiene, let's fix my spelling here. Le tiene miedo a los perros. Let's try they're afraid of dogs. So le tienen miedo a los perros. Again, you can see everything's stationary, and I'm just conjugating tener. Something else you might be afraid of are spiders. And the word for spider is araña. And of course, we will say afraid of the spiders. So be las arañas. So again, I simply conjugate tener. I'm afraid of spiders. Le tengo miedo a las arañas. He's afraid of spiders. Le tiene miedo a las arañas. We're afraid of spiders. Le tenemos miedo a las arañas. Going back to an earlier slide, we get reminded of the problem we're trying to get around. So in the first one I have I'm afraid of heights using a, and in the second one I'm afraid of dogs using de. With the formula that I've given you, we get to solve this problem. So it would be always at the front le. And that means that a is correct here, and if we change it to le also here, so le tengo miedo, this now will be solved and go to a as well. So it gives us a very stable formula that we can use without making or having to make this awkward choice between a or de. And with this formula, you'll always use a no matter what it is that you're saying you're afraid of. Now I'd like you to try some on your own. How would you ask, are you afraid of heights? ¿Le tienes miedo a las alturas? Are you afraid of dogs? ¿Le tienes miedo a los perros? What about I'm afraid of dogs? Le tengo miedo a los perros. I'm afraid of heights. Le tengo miedo a las alturas. I'm not afraid of heights. No le tengo miedo a las alturas. Once again, the word for spiders is arañas. How would you say, I'm afraid of spiders? Le tengo miedo a las arañas. The word for snakes is serpientes. How would you say, we're afraid of snakes? Le tenemos miedo a las serpientes. They're afraid of snakes. Le tienen miedo a las serpientes. They're not afraid of snakes. No le tienen miedo a las serpientes. Now, this same formula will also work for us in the past. So once again, we're simply manipulating the verb tener. You might want to say that you used to be afraid of something. So again, let's say it was heights. Now, used to be, we're going to use that imperfect sound, so tener would become tenía. So I used to be afraid of heights. Le tenía miedo a las alturas. I used to be afraid of dogs. Le tenía miedo a los perros. And of course, the angle will change here depending on what you want to say, from tenía, tenías, teníamos, or tenían. How would you say, I used to be afraid of spiders? Le tenía miedo a las arañas. The expression, when I was young, that will take the imperfect sound. And the word for young is joven. So we're going to have to use ser here, and it's going to have to be in the imperfect. So how would you say that, when I was young? Cuando era joven. Now say, I was afraid of dogs when I was young. Le tenía miedo a los perros cuando era joven. Of course, you could also reverse the order and say, cuando era joven, le tenía miedo a los perros. There are, of course, some situations or some things you may be visualizing that will put you into the simple past. And again, the formula will remain the same. So this is where we are imagining a set period of time or within this time frame. So an example sentence would be, I was afraid of him during our marriage. Now, during our marriage would be durante nuestro matrimonio. And we're saying that within that set period of time, I was afraid of him. So this will force us into the simple past. And here we will use that inside the formula. So it will become tuve. So let's write it inside the brackets here. So le tuve miedo a él durante nuestro matrimonio. So here we have the same formula, and we've switched into the simple past because we're expressing that during this time in our life, we were afraid of him. As always, the important thing to remember is that it doesn't matter what I'm saying I'm afraid of, whether it's an animal or heights or a person. This formula is remaining stationary, right? It's remaining solid. It's something that we can depend on. We only have to focus or put thinking effort into the conjugation of tener. Welcome to part 2. Another phrase we'll look at is to be careful. And of course, in English, we would say, I am careful. However, in Spanish, this would literally be, I have care or I have careful. Doesn't make much sense in a literal way. Now, the word for care or careful is cuidado. So, I am careful would become tengo cuidado. Let's look at this example phrase now. I'm careful with money. Now, just as in the last lesson where we were putting I'm afraid of the dogs or I'm afraid of the heights, you'll do the same thing here. So you will literally say I'm careful with the money. This would become tengo cuidado con el dinero. How would you say she's careful with money? Tiene cuidado con el dinero. What about she's careful with her money? Tiene cuidado con su dinero. This is quite a simple formula. You'll always have cuidado con followed by whatever it is, and you'll just manipulate the same as before the verb tener. Now, having care or taking care is quite often used as a command. For example, you can tell someone, be careful. Now, in Spanish, this is quite easy to do. This phrase becomes ten cuidado. This ten is actually the imperative form of the verb tener, and it's something we haven't covered in the course yet, but we're just going to learn this as a phrase. So, ten cuidado is when you're telling someone directly to be careful. How would you say be careful with? Ten cuidado con. What about be careful with that? Ten cuidado con eso. Here, of course, you could have a choice. You could say eso, or ese, or esa, depending on if you were referring to a specific noun, which was either masculine or feminine noun. And by using eso, I'm just referring to the general situation. So be careful with that. Ten cuidado con eso. Let's get more specific now. How would you say, be careful with the dog? Ten cuidado con el perro. Be careful with her arm. The word for arm is brazo. Ten cuidado con su brazo. You'll also find yourself using this phrase of to be careful inside of modal verb structure. In this case, it would become tener cuidado. So, for example, you should be careful with that. How would you say it? Deberías tener cuidado con eso. So, you should, deberías, then have care, be careful as we would say in English, tener cuidado con eso. What about we're going to be careful? Vamos a tener cuidado. She has to be careful with them. Tiene que tener cuidado con ellos. You could also say here, hay que tener cuidado con ellos. It will be written literally like this. And you'll hear this phrase being used quite frequently. Hay que. It sort of means one must or one should take care. To express very careful, it would become mucho cuidado. How would you say she has to be very careful with them? Tiene que tener mucho cuidado con ellos. Equally, you could say hay que tener mucho cuidado con ellos. You should be more careful with money. Notice here the word is more careful, so más cuidado. How would you say it? Deberías tener más cuidado con el dinero. I'm going to be more careful. Voy a tener más cuidado. You can see how sometimes it gets a little tricky, especially if you're trying to think it out in a literal way, because in English we can clearly see the verb to be here, so our mind will instantly run to that. However, you must remember that in many common phrases like these, this is where Spanish is not using the verb to be, but instead is using the verb tener. So literally, I'm going to have more care. To express next time, it would be la próxima vez. Try this one. I'm going to be more careful next time. Voy a tener más cuidado la próxima vez. Looking at the past now, we of course can have our simple past or our open line. So we come back to our sounds of tenía or tuve. This again obviously depends on what you are visualizing. So you can imagine being careful for this moment in time, in which case it would be tuve cuidado, or I was careful more as background, okay, so describing the scene, and this would give you tenía cuidado. Again, both are possible. For example, I was being careful when something else happened. This is where you would go into the sound of tenía cuidado cuando. So I was having care when this happened. We know from previous lessons that something like this, I was always careful. This word always, being siempre in Spanish, pushes us into the simple past. It has to be that way. So this is an example of where you would switch over. So you would have now siempre tuve cuidado. Now, for the sake of simplicity, we'll make the following responses all happening inside of the simple past. For example, we take a question like, were you careful? So we're imagining this particular scene or this particular moment in time. This is what we're imagining, and we're asking that person if they were careful inside of that time frame. How would you do that? ¿Tuviste cuidado? What about he wasn't very careful? Again, it's within the simple past. No tuvo mucho cuidado. No tuvo mucho cuidado. We were always careful with money. Siempre tuvimos cuidado con el dinero. They were careful. Tuvieron cuidado. Let's extend this idea now with the phrase, they were careful too. This is an easy mistake to make if you don't know or you haven't seen this before in Spanish, because this would actually become de, meaning tuvieron cuidado de. Now, it doesn't matter what the angle is. Here we're using they were careful to, but it could be I was careful to, you were careful to, we were careful to, and so forth. In every case, you will be adding on de to the end of it. Can you guess what the verb to offend is? Ofender. If we wanted to say they were careful not to offend him, of course you could also say they were careful to not offend him. Either way, it's going to be the same in Spanish. This would be tuvieron cuidado de no ofenderlo. Again, with tuvieron, we're imagining that in this moment in time or in this particular scene, they were careful not to offend him. De no ofenderlo. How would you say we were careful to not offend her? Tuvimos cuidado de no ofenderla. She was careful not to offend us. Tuvo cuidado de no ofendernos. This formula will work with any verb. For example, to make mistakes would be to commit mistakes. So you have cometer errores. How would you say, I was careful not to make mistakes. And let's imagine that we're thinking of just this open line here, so the imperfect sound. Tenía cuidado de no cometer errores. So I was careful, or I was being careful to not make mistakes. The phrase to be hot or to be cold is another example of where Spanish will use to have hot or to have cold. So instead of I am hot, it will become I have hot. Now the word for hot is calor. So saying I'm hot, tengo calor, I have hot, or I have heat. Now the word for cold is frío. So how would you say I'm cold? Tengo frío. What about asking, are you hot? ¿Tienes calor? She says she's cold. Dice que tiene frío. We're very hot in this room. For room, we'll use the word cuarto. Tenemos mucho calor en este cuarto. They told me that they're cold. Me dijeron que tienen frío. We can use this, of course, also with modal verbs. So, how would you say you're going to feel cold there? Vas a tener frío allí. Because we're in modal verb structure, we're still using the verb tener, but it's the full verb now. So literally, you're going to have cold there instead of you're going to be cold there. So, vas a tener frío allí. Let's extend this idea. So, without a jacket, you're going to feel cold. So, the word for jacket can be abrigo. How would you say it? Sin un abrigo, vas a tener frío. What about they don't like feeling or being hot? Either way will be the same in Spanish. No les gusta tener calor. So to them it is not pleasing to have heat. To express I hate in Spanish would be odio. How would you say I hate being cold? Odio tener frío. I hate being hot. Odio tener calor. Inside the past, we'll get the same issues where you can have the imperfect or the simple past. Let's stick with this idea of the open imperfect. So how would you express I was cold? Tenía frío. I was very cold. Tenía mucho frío. We were very cold at the concert. Teníamos mucho frío en el concierto. Of course, if we were to switch and said tuvimos mucho frío en el concierto, this would then apply that we were cold, but then that ended, okay? Something happened, we're no longer cold after that. But just this open phrase of we were cold at the concert, it's more natural to keep it with the imperfect. So, teníamos mucho frío en el concierto. One thing you might ask is, we have this phrase in English about being a cold person. Okay, so he or she is a cold person. And you might wonder if this phrase is also possible in Spanish. Do they have that expression of a cold person? The answer is yes, they do. In that sense, you will no longer use the verb tener, but you will switch into ser or estar. So for example, she's very cold, meaning her personality. So would you use ser or estar for this? It's going to be ser because it's relating to her identity. So you would literally say, ella es muy fría. So here we have ser And notice it's not frío, but fría, because we're now describing her personality as being cold. So ella es muy fría. Now I mentioned that this could be either ser or estar, because maybe this person is just being cold to you right now, or it happened yesterday that she was cold to you, but this is not necessarily the identity that you apply to her all the time. This is where you would go into estar. For example, I spoke with her and she was very cold with me. How would you say that? Hablé con ella y estaba muy fría conmigo. So here we're just expressing that at this particular moment, or on this occasion when I spoke with her, she was cold with me. Estaba muy fría conmigo. The next expressions I'd like to cover are to be hungry and to be thirsty. Now, of course, in English, we say, I am hungry. However, in Spanish, I have hunger. Now, the word for hunger is hambre. So, I am hungry would become tengo hambre. Literally, I have hunger. It's very important also to realize that hambre is a feminine word in Spanish. So, la hambre. So, to say, I am very hungry, you would then be saying, I have a lot of hunger in Spanish. I wonder if you can try to figure out how to say that. Tengo mucha hambre. You can see here from mucha, this is the reason that I emphasize that it's la hambre, a feminine word. Now, saying that you're thirsty works in the same way. In Spanish, you will say, I have thirst. Now, the word for thirst is sed. And again, this is a feminine word, so la sed. How would you say, I am thirsty? Tengo sed. I am very thirsty. Tengo mucha sed. How would you ask, are you hungry? ¿Tienes hambre? Are you thirsty? ¿Tienes sed? He's not hungry yet. No tiene hambre todavía. We're very hungry. Tenemos mucha hambre. They said they're not hungry. Dijeron que no tienen hambre. What about they're not thirsty? No tienen sed. Moving into modal verb structure now, you will use the full verb, so tener hambre or tener sed. For example, how would you say you're going to be hungry later? Vas a tener hambre más tarde. We looked at before the word for I hate, which is odio. How would you say I hate being hungry? Odio tener hambre. In the past, we have the same choices as before, the imperfect or the simple past, depending on the situation. So, for example, to say I was very hungry, it could be either tenía mucha hambre or tuve mucha hambre. Let's stick with this open line of the imperfect for now. How would you say we were very hungry, so we ate a pizza? Teníamos mucha hambre, así que comimos una pizza. Here we have our open line. This was what was going on. We were very hungry. And then on top of that timeline, this is what happened. We ate a pizza. What about this one? They were hungry, so they decided to buy something to eat. Tenían hambre, así que decidieron comprar algo de comer. How would you say she wasn't very hungry? No tenía mucha hambre. Switching over to being thirsty, it's going to work in the same way. So how would you say I was thirsty? Tenía sed. I was very thirsty. Tenía mucha sed. I asked him and he said he wasn't thirsty. Le pregunté y me dijo que no tenía sed. Notice that through many of these examples, we have a tendency to stay with this imperfect sound in the past, and that is what I advise you to do unless you have a specific reason to go into the simple past. Our fifth expression is to be lucky. In English, we'll say, I am lucky, whereas in Spanish, I have luck. Now, the word for luck is suerte, and again, it's a feminine word, so la suerte. This will become important later on. How would you say I'm lucky? Tengo suerte. Now say I'm very lucky. Tengo mucha suerte. You can see mucha because it's la suerte. What about I'm not very lucky? No tengo mucha suerte. Literally, I don't have much luck or a lot of luck. Obviously, with all these phrases, switching to other angles will behave in the same way. You just continue to manipulate the verb tener. Looking into the past, we again have our choice between imperfect or simple past. So, I was lucky could be either tenía suerte or tuve suerte. This time, let's stick with this sound of the simple past. So we're imagining for this period of time or in this moment or for this particular event, we were lucky. How would you say you were very lucky yesterday? Tuviste mucha suerte ayer. You were lucky with the weather. For weather, we'll use the word tiempo. Tuviste suerte con el tiempo. So here we are visualizing, perhaps it was some event outside, like a wedding, and we got lucky with the weather. So in this case, we're going to say or use the simple past. How would you express he wasn't very lucky? Now here, let's not imagine that this is for a particular event. Let's just leave it as an open line in the past. No tenía mucha suerte. In this sort of phrase, just on its own without any other context, the vast majority of native Spanish speakers will use tenía because they're not being given any particular strong reason to go into the simple past or into the preterite, so they will default back into using the imperfect. I'd like to extend this phrase slightly now. If we look at the sentence we have, we were lucky to whatever, to see him, to be there, to arrive on time. So for this to, you're going to use the phrase of suerte de, followed by the verb. And of course you'll have the verb tener in whatever form at the front. But the important bit is that you're going to follow suerte with de and then the verb. So we were lucky to see him. It would be tuvimos suerte de verlo. Inside of modal verb structure, you will use the full verb, so tener suerte. For example, if we wanted to say, I feel she's going to be lucky. So for I feel, you'll use siento. Try to do the rest yourself. Siento que va a tener suerte. So I feel that. Siento que she's going to have luck. Va a tener suerte. What about this one? You need to be lucky to win it. The verb to win is ganar. Necesitas tener suerte para ganarlo. It was important in this phrase to realize that to win it means in order to win it. So, necesitas tener suerte para ganarlo. Last thing for this expression is you'll very often hear or will want to say yourself, good luck. And to express that in Spanish is simply suerte. Welcome to part 4. Our next expression is to be right. Of course, in English we say, I'm right. But in Spanish, they say, I have reason. Now the word for reason is razón, and again, it's a feminine word, so la razón. How would you say, I'm right? Tengo razón. I know I'm right. Sé que tengo razón. How would you say, you're right? Tienes razón. To express you're absolutely right, they will say, you have all the reason. So it would be, tienes toda la razón. How would you say she's right? Tiene razón. They said we're right. Dijeron que tenemos razón. They know they're right. Saben que tienen razón. Into the past, most of the time, you will use this open imperfect line. How would you say, I was right? Tenía razón. To express I was right about, you'll use the word sobre for about. So, for example, how would you say, I was right about him? Tenía razón sobre él. You were right about her. Tenías razón sobre ella. If we used tuviste razón, so using the simple past, it would mean that, well, you were right about her, but just for this particular time, and then you were wrong about her. You see, it doesn't really make much sense, or it would be difficult to think up of situations that you would commonly use that for. So that's the reason why most of the time with this phrase you'll use the sound of tenía. Let's continue. How would you say, he was right about you? Tenía razón sobre ti. We were right about them. Teníamos razón sobre ellos. One more. They were right about the price. Tenían razón sobre el precio. So you can see with this phrase of tener razón sobre, it can be either right about people or right about things or situations. It's all going to work in the same way. Now, age is also expressed differently in Spanish. Where we have, for example, I am 40, in Spanish you'll say, I have 40. How would you say that? Tengo 40. What about he's 13? Tiene 13. If you wanted to extend it and say he's 13 years old, it would simply become tiene 13 años. So he has 13 years. And obviously this structure would remain the same, and you're just changing the number. Looking now into the past, just like having luck or being lucky, the vast majority of the time you will be using the imperfect sound when talking about age. So for example, how would you say I was 12? Tenía 12. Then obviously to continue this, you could say tenía 12 cuando whatever it was happened. So this line going across in the past like that. Moving into modal verb structure, you can have basically tener plus the number. So for example, how would you say, I'm going to be 30? Voy a tener 30. Another one of these short phrases is the idea of being sleepy or being tired. So instead of saying I am sleepy, you will say I have sleep. Now the word for sleep is sueño, and sueño also means dream, so it has a double meaning with the word. So I'm sleepy would literally be tengo sueño, I have sleep. How would you ask, Are you sleepy? ¿Tienes sueño? Of course, to say you're tired would be a different word. That would be cansado or cansada. So, are you tired? ¿Estás cansado? Two are more or less interchangeable, but of course there will be occasions when one is more applicable than the other. How would you say, I'm very sleepy? Tengo mucho sueño. In the past, I could imagine scenarios where you could use either the imperfect or the simple past. Having said that, I still think that this open line will be far more commonly used. So let's stick with that. How would you say I was sleepy? Tenía sueño. I was very sleepy. Tenía mucho sueño. Now, phrase number 9, to be successful. In English, we could say, I am successful, but in Spanish, I have success. The key word here is éxito. So, success is éxito. Therefore, I'm successful will become tengo éxito. I have success. How would you say, I am very successful? Tengo mucho éxito. She is successful. Tiene éxito. We are successful. Tenemos éxito. They are successful. Tienen éxito. Into the past, of course, our two choices remain, and again I can think of situations where both would be possible, but we will still default back to this open line most of the time. How would you say, were you successful? ¿Tenías éxito? He was very successful. Tenía mucho éxito. Let's pause here and look at this. If we said tuve mucho éxito, that again would mean that he had a lot of success, but just between this point and that point. Then it stopped and he wasn't having success after that. This is why this phrase will tend to use that imperfect open line across the past. One more. How would you say, she says that they're very successful? Dice que tienen mucho éxito. To finish, let's look at using this phrase inside of modal verb structure. So you're going to be using the full verb tener éxito. How would you say, we're going to be successful? Vamos a tener éxito. They're not going to be successful. No van a tener éxito. You should be successful. Deberías tener éxito. If you do it well, you should be successful. Si lo haces bien, deberías tener éxito. She was going to be successful. Iba a tener éxito. I would like to be very successful. Me gustaría tener mucho éxito. Finally, this one. Yes, it was successful. Sí, tenía éxito.
Expressions with tener drill. She's 14. Tiene 14. You have to be lucky to succeed. Hay que tener suerte para tener éxito. Everyone was very hungry. Todo el mundo tenía mucha hambre. Be careful with the glass, please. Ten cuidado con el vaso, por favor. There's no reason to be afraid No hay razón para tener miedo ahora. I was 40 yesterday. Tenía 40 ayer. Were you afraid of them? ¿Tenías miedo de ellos? I feel hot in this sweater. Tengo calor con este suéter. He said they are very successful. Dijo que tienen mucho éxito. I'm sleepy. Tengo sueño. He was very lucky. Tuvo mucha suerte. You know that I'm right. Sabes que tengo razón. I'm going to be right. Voy a tener razón. Good luck with that. Suerte con eso. Are you thirsty? ¿Tienes sed? They were careful not to upset him. Tuvieron cuidado de no molestarlo. This time she's going to be more careful. Esta vez va a tener más cuidado. My daughter is sleepy. Mi hija tiene sueño. I was very cold there. Tenía mucho frío allí. We were successful. Teníamos éxito. They aren't afraid of you. No tienen miedo de ti. We are cold. Tenemos frío. He's going to be 15 tomorrow. Va a tener 15 mañana. We're going to be careful. Vamos a tener cuidado. You were right. Tenías razón. You're going to be very thirsty. Vas a tener mucha sed. We are careful with our expenses. Tenemos cuidado con nuestros gastos.